Okay, everyone, we're going to get started here. Just to respect our time, and we have a really exciting presentation to participate in today. So without further ado, my name is Casey Mattoon, and I'm going to be your facilitator for today. Jen sends her best and has still been intimately involved in the planning of today's session, including the homework that you received, the handouts that you've received, and the activities that we're working on. She unfortunately was unable to attend today for a family emergency. So we, on behalf of the City on Our Path Home, are sending our best wishes to Jen and her family. Really quickly, in your materials that you received, you have like always, the agenda, which references the homework that was assigned before today, in addition to what the objective of this week is and a forward-looking objective for week 4. We also have a week-by-week schedule for the task force. So many of the questions that we're discussing, we wanted to get a little bit beyond just the very simple name for the week and tell you what the objectives are, including a plan on who's going to be presenting on different pieces of information that we think will be helpful. And we also have a glossary of terms, including references where we loosely pulled information to get to the final landing place on those terms. There is a lot that we're learning about how this system for homelessness prevention, diversion, and solution works. And so we wanted to make sure that you all have a coherent narrative that goes with a coherent glossary. With that, I think I'm going to pass it to Courtney to give us a little introduction today, just to cover some things, and then we'll come back and move through a couple of activities before we jump online with our facilitator, who is joining us from the National Alliance to End Homelessness. So, Courtney.
Good morning, everybody. Thanks for your patience as we continue this awkward arrangement. It seems real silly for me to need to look at the screen to see who's behind me, but we're doing so to keep everyone as safe as we possibly can. So thanks for all the work you've done so far. As we head into the third meeting, I'd just like to review the charge of the group. So as a reminder, our goals are to unpack the issues of homelessness in our community, to review the shelter needs analysis and strategic land assessment, and to establish a framework to collectively evaluate potential solutions that are in line with best practices. As you all know, our last 2 meetings have provided a baseline for all of us to better understand the complexity of homelessness and where shelters fit into the broader homelessness system response. And today we're going to take a deeper dive into what shelter better means, specifically around low barrier and housing first orientation. And then, as Casey mentioned, in your handouts are the next 4 meetings. I'll just touch on those briefly. And our week 4 meeting is to review data around the number of shelter beds available in the city and the target population for those beds, as well as the difference between shelter, affordable housing, and supportive housing. And then in week 5, we'll hear from Interfaith Sanctuary, including staff and guests, about their current operations and their plans for a future facility. And then in week 6, we will work through siting a shelter in Boise by finalizing the list of potential sites that we will cross-reference with the feasibility criteria, which is that what's on the wall behind me, which is on the wall behind me. And in week 7, we'll workshop potential sites and ultimately land on a decision for the location of the new shelter. And then in week 8, make final edits, updates to the report as we prepare to present this information to both the mayor, the Planning Zoning Commission, and the Boise City Council. So with that, I did need to mention that Council President Elaine Clegg has a conflict, so she will not be joining us today. And again, at any time between this meeting and the next meeting, you have any feedback regarding the work, the focus, or any information you might need about these meetings, just let me know. Thanks, everybody.
Perfect. Thank you, Courtney. And just a little heads up, we did that reminder and recentering on what the objectives are, because there have been a lot of questions, I think, from you all when we were reviewing the feasibility criteria and how those relate to the objective of this task force. So wanted to revisit those from week 1. And I'm going to mix up the agenda a little bit because I think these things are easier to move forward to. But as part of the work with this task force, each week you'll notice that we're coming back with different components and trying to get to a more final place or continued engagement on those components. So for this week, one of the components that we'd like to finalize is our partnership statement of commitment. This partnership statement of commitment was introduced in week 1. We've reviewed it a couple of times, gotten a lot of feedback and made adjustments. And last time when we asked folks to name kind of where they're at with this presentation for us, we did a thumb thing, which is like, that's incredible. I'm all the way there, to I still have incredible problems with it. And the super majority of people were up here. And so I wanted to get one more read on the room on where are we at with the partnership statement of commitment, knowing that we didn't get any additional feedback on changes last time. So if you could quickly kind of show me with your thumb where you're at on that. Great. So supermajority up here. And as the mayor indicated, we're going to move through decision-making that isn't always going to be consensus-based. So I think what we're going to ask you all to do is after today, when you're leaving the session, if you could go up and add your name to the partner statement commitment, indicating that this is kind of something that we've workshopped towards, had opportunity to provide feedback, made adjustments on, and are ready to move forward, that's kind of like this, the primary charge of the task force and the commitment that we're making moving together. So with that, and if you were anywhere but here, you can come up to me afterwards and we can have a conversation about what feedback has been provided, how we've made those adjustments, and what still wasn't there, and talk about if there's anything that we can do to make your comfortability higher. The next thing that we wanted to name is we got so many questions on the feasibility criteria, which is exactly what we were hoping for and expecting. And when we're trying to figure out the best way to approach this, we kind of decided to do 2 concurrent pathways. The first is the Our Path Home staff, which is myself and Rachel, are actively working on answering every single question that you provided us, including some comments that did not end in a question mark, which was not the activity, but we're going to make sure that we include responses to those. And we are going to provide those in written format. We are taking our time because those questions are incredibly pointed, and we want to make sure that we're giving you pointed answers back. We are also working on answers to those questions with experts and partners in the field, because some of those questions are related to ongoing work that we're doing on a needs analysis for the shelter. And some of those questions are only able to be answered by partners that are directly involved in the project as it was proposed at the State Street location. So that's one. We're working on getting those answers. Our goal / hope is to have those back to this task force by next week. The second thing that we decided would be really helpful, because there has been so much engagement on the feasibility criteria, Rachel and myself for this session and for next session at minimum are going to stay back 30 minutes after the task force and just have an open dialogue with anybody who wants to go deeper. And that's moving from inquiry, which is where we asked you all to start last week, and just posing your questions on what is there. And now we'd like to open it up to a conversation where you're able to provide additional inquiry that you have, but also comments, questions, and suggestions for alternatives, so that we make sure that we're continuing to engage in a dialogue with one another. So we won't do that in this time, because this time is sacred. And as you can see, Mia just jumped on the screen for the presentation, but 30 minutes after today. And if you're unable to make it today, because it was a shift in our schedule, 30 minutes after our next session, Rachel and I will be here, and we are ready to have a conversation with you to elicit more feedback from you. So to get warmed up, those are kind of things that we're moving forward. And then as part of both of those things connected together, we realized that there were still some questions kind of on like, what is this task force doing? And a lot of the questions on the feasibility criteria were asking for things that we believe are going to be coming. So for a warm-up activity today, I want you to take some time now, pull out this 8-week schedule, and you'll see that we've done the work to outline not only what is the generic title of the task force session as it was on the website, but we've outlined what is the objective. So what are we as a facilitation and design team trying to put in front of this task force to increase our shared understanding, so that we are ready to make decisions when it comes to the charge of this task force of siting a shelter, including recommendations for how it should operate. So what we've done here is outlined objectives. I want you to take a minute, read through these things. I would encourage you to highlight or star in some way, anything that's really resonating with you, anything that you're really excited about, put question marks next to things that you want more information on. And the activity where we're going to have you land is, I want folks to be able to answer, what week are you most looking forward to or have you most enjoyed? So looking forward and looking backward, what week of this task force feels like it's the most exciting to you or that is going to provide you with the most enjoyment? And the next one that we're going to ask you to answer, so we always do a positive negative flip on these, is what are you most concerned about? So looking at this schedule, looking at the 8 weeks, which week are you most concerned about? And what are your concerns related to that week? So we're going to have about 4 minutes to do this. So take your time, move through those objectives again, starring, underlining, whatever it works for you in terms of indicating points of interest, points of confusion, and then at the end, landing on which week are you most excited about and why, and which week are you concerned about and what are your concerns? Go ahead. All right, take about another minute, and then I'm going to ask a few folks to share back. And we'll start with the question 1 first, of which one is most exciting, and then we'll move to the concern. And as we're wrapping up, if you'd like to share, if you could just indicate in some way to Laura, she'll come around with microphones. So I'm going to take 2 for the first question on which week are you most excited about or did you most enjoy? So if anybody's ready to share, if you could indicate to Laura and she'll run over a mic so our folks online can hear you. And make sure you say your name before chatting.
Hi, I'm Jennifer Godoy. I think I'm most excited about week 4 next week. I'm looking forward to the data. I guess we're supposed to keep these on, aren't we? Yeah, right. Sorry. Still learning new habits. I'm excited to see the data, to see what's coming up.
Great.
And Stephanie Day. I am also really excited about week 4, mostly just to think about what are the reasons that some folks have not felt comfortable in a shelter and how could we actually make a shelter that felt comfortable to folks that currently don't feel that way. And not super nervous about any of the weeks, but I think probably most of us, week 7, the sighting conversation, I think is going to be the most interesting, just because I think there's a lot of emotion involved in it. But I think we'll have done a lot of work by that point and be able to have a productive conversation.
Great. Thanks so much, Stephanie and Jennifer. So we'll move on to that second question, which Stephanie provided us a good bridge towards. Other folks want to indicate if you'd like to speak to which one is most concerning to you and kind of letting us know a little bit about the why there. So again, if you'd like to speak to this, just indicate to Laura and she'd be happy to run you a microphone.
Yeah, this is B Black, WCA. I would agree with Stephanie. I think week 7, I'm most concerned about, just from the standpoint of, I think the lead up and all the work that's done ahead of that is really good. I'm just hoping that people come to it with an open mind and that people aren't stuck with a fixed decision when we enter that discussion.
Thanks, B.
Hi, this is Gary Zimmerman.
Gary, if you could hold the mic just a little bit up, we were having. Sorry about that. I just want to make sure folks online can hear for sure.
All right, is that working better? Hi, this is Gary Zimmerman, and I mean, from a concerns perspective, I think we're doing a really good job of walking through the structure of, affordable housing systems and solving needs for the homeless population as well. But what I don't see in a progression of 8 weeks is a place where the community that's struggling to incorporate some of these elements is able to lay out why it has concerns so that those can be factored into this 8-week process.
Great. Thank you, Gary. Anybody else want to share a concern? And then we'll have time for just one more if anybody else would like to add in.
My concern is that, I'm Serena, by the way, for those of you who are online. My concern is that this may not be a one-size-fits-all kind of solution. And so I'm having a hard time breathing going forward, what it's going to look like for the people that don't fit into this one box. Because it's an ongoing issue. That's where my concern is. Like, we get this, what's going to be next?
Anyone else want to jump in for a last comment? Laura, we have one more down here. And with this, we'll wrap up this session.
Hi, Hillary Takahashi. I've got 2 things I'm going to go over really quickly. One of the biggest concerns, I'm from Collister neighborhood, so one of our biggest concerns for Collister is traffic. I see nothing with ACHD on here and how we could reduce or make that corridor safer. And secondly, what if we don't find a one-site solution and it needs to be multi-site? Do we have room in this agenda and in this forum to make that part of a solution? This seems to be an only one-site solution oriented focus. And what if it's a multi-site solution?
Great. Okay, thanks so much for that. And I think you'll notice from Jen's facilitation and the construction of agendas moving forward that our intention is to provide as much information and bring into this room the conflict that inherently exists within this discussion, right? We are in this room today because there is a point of tension, and it is the job and the charge of this task force to have the adequate conversation around the tension that exists within this topic and land on a recommendation that works for citing emergency shelter, that works with the City of Boise's homeless system response. So we will continue to push you all to name more clearly and adeptly what are the concerns that we have to make sure that we are providing an agenda and a facilitation plan that helps us address those things. So before we move on, there are 2 more things I just wanted to, in addition to Elaine Clegg being absent today, who we have her note taker stand-in Amanda over there taking detailed notes. We also have, for Katie Decker, we have Gary Zimmerman joining us. We're the Veterans Park Neighborhood Association. And for Jen Pelagi from the Health Systems representative, we've switched from Jen, who's accepted a brand new job at the Department of Health and Welfare, so moved out of the system, and Rebecca Lemons from St. Alfonso's has stepped in her place. So she's been joining online because St. Al's has particular regulations around participation for in-person events, so they're only able to join remotely. And starting today, Rebecca is as like an attendee or panelist in the webinar, so she'll be able to participate and weigh in directly on the screen. So she's online. If she unmutes and talks at any point, you'll see her face pop up nice and big on that screen. 2 more things. Father Jesus Camacho is unable to attend today due to an ongoing health issue that Father Camacho is having. So we're in conversations about how we can best support him. And Jeanette Curtis from the street outreach team is unavailable today, but wasn't able to send a replacement. So those are the major things on that. And then I see everyone wearing masks, which is great. And yes, if you could, when you do speak into mic, try to keep your mask on and just project a little bit harder potentially. I know it's really uncomfortable, but we're trying to do the best that we can to make sure that everyone is safe. So with that, we'll move it to our next agenda item. We have a presentation from the National Alliance to End Homelessness. And I will not do too much purviewing of what their role is within the homeless response system nationally, but we are super excited to have Mia joining us. I got connected with Mia because when this conversation popped up, and like I told you last time, I'm brand new to the role. I looked for what is the best course that you can do for learning on emergency shelter and signed up for a 3-week intensive course from the National Alliance to End Homelessness, who is nationally recognized for their best practices, not only in other solutions geared towards homelessness, but explicitly and specifically when it comes to the role of emergency shelter and how we advance that in communities towards a solution to end homelessness. Mia was incredible there, and I'm super excited to have them joining us. So Mia, if you could come off mute. Oh, perfect.
Hi, everyone.
Great.
Good
So
morning.
Mia is going to be doing the presentation from here. They'll show their screen. You should be able to see them in the materials that they're presenting at the same time. And then at different points, Mia will be having interactive portions. And when she has those interactive portions, both Laura and myself will be mic runners. So again, just continually indicate to us if there's something that you want to say. And then we'll also have index cards in case there's a point where Mia wants us to solicit written questions or written feedback from y'all. So without further ado, let's all welcome Mia.
Good morning. Just making sure you all can hear me okay. Okay, I think I saw a thumb up. Okay, perfect. Well, good morning to you all. So happy to be with you today. So happy to meet Casey and hear more about what's happening in the city of Boise around the shelter relocation. So I wanted to just quickly introduce myself. My name is Tashmia or Mia Bryant. I am a senior technical assistance specialist at the National Alliance to End Homelessness, which is based in Washington, D.C. I'm part of the capacity building team, which works with communities throughout the country to further their efforts in homelessness, whether that's in rapid rehousing, emergency shelter, diversion, you name it. And we also support, promote, and train on best practices in ending homelessness, again, within all those different areas that I discussed. The Alliance in general is heavily involved in policy as well, data collection and analysis, as well as providing conferences and other venues and platforms to further the work of ending homelessness. Previously, before my role in National Alliance to End Homelessness, I was leading race equity and training for the state of Connecticut, working with both of our continuums of cares or COCs, doing things like coordinating and running our rapid housing learning collaborative, starting up our diversion learning collaborative, and doing trainings on emergency shelter best practices and ending homelessness through emergency shelter best practices. So just wanted to quickly kind of introduce myself in that way. But I also wanted to kind of introduce what I'm going to be talking about today, which is understanding the role of emergency shelter in ending homelessness. Understand that ultimately your goal is to identify the relocation of a shelter. However, it is imperative to understand really what is the role of a shelter in ending homelessness so that you're able to identify what are the gaps, what are the needs in your community, and how can your decision help to address those gaps, to fill those gaps so that you can end homelessness in your city and ultimately within your state, because it's all connected. The work that you guys are doing here it's all part of a greater effort and system to end homelessness, again, in your city, in your state, and honestly throughout the country. So I'm going to be talking about really the role of emergency shelter, some things to be considering so that, again, you can identify how does that fit into what we're trying to do? What is the role of our decision in addressing some of these needs and gaps that we have within our community? So I want to start off by just proclaiming and saying that homelessness is a public health concern. So when you think about people who are experiencing homelessness, consider that people who are experiencing homelessness overutilize the emergency response system. If you're thinking about COVID, I think we all got a big wake up call with the COVID response that was happening in our communities, realizing that there was a challenge in people being able to quarantine or being able to social distance, considering they didn't have a place to call home. So when you're thinking about homelessness, think about it in the sense of it being a public health crisis and something that needs to be ended and addressed now. Because housing is just as important as food, water, warmth, rest. This is Maslow's hierarchy of needs. I'm sure some of you may at least be familiar with this chart. Housing satisfies a basic need that people have. And is a foundational need that they have so that they're able to accomplish other parts of their needs, which include self-esteem needs, belonging and loving needs, and self-actualization. We show this chart because oftentimes it is it's thought that people who are experiencing homelessness are homeless because of their sobriety issues or because of their mental health issues and things like that. However, it's harder for people to be able to resolve some of those issues if they do not have housing. Housing is one of those basic foundational needs that needs to be satisfied in order for people to accomplish other goals that they may have in their life. So ultimately, the goal is to house people as quickly as possible and divert people from imminent homelessness wherever possible. So if folks do have to enter the homeless response system, having a system that is coordinated and resourced in a way that is quickly moving people through that system and into permanent housing or back into permanent housing. When we say end homelessness, that means make homelessness rare, brief, and one time. That doesn't mean that people will never become homeless again in their lives. It means that when people do face a crisis, having an episode of homelessness, that the system is designed and equipped to quickly address their homelessness in a way where either it can avoid them from having to experience homelessness, or it can make it one time if they did have to spend at least one night unsheltered or in a homeless shelter. That is the only experience that they have. We're making that we're ensuring that that's only a one-time experience and people aren't returning to homelessness. So that's what we mean by in homelessness, and that's ultimately the main major goal of an effective homeless response system. But it is not just the role of the homeless response system to end homelessness. Ultimately, it takes a village. So whatever your role is, whether you're involved in healthcare, mental health, child care, if you're just a neighbor that's concerned, whatever your role is, define what your role is in ending homelessness. So the homeless system's role is to ensure that interventions are scaled, accessible, and tailored. We want to make sure that we are providing just the right enough amount of support to help someone get into permanent housing. It's accessible to all who need it. And again, tailored so that we're meeting those unique needs that folks have. So not a one size fits all approach. Getting people housed ASAP is important, as soon as possible, because we know that the longer folks experience homelessness, the harder it is to get them out of homelessness. So we want to ensure that people, are housed as quickly as possible. And then making those necessary and appropriate connections to keep people housed. So it's not the homeless response system to provide support for that person for the rest of their life. Ultimately, we are an emergency service, an emergency intervention and resource to be able to quickly get someone to housing. And then we make those community connections so that we can support people in staying housed, or the community can support people in being able to stay housed. So that requires those warm handoffs. So again, when I say define your role, look at that bottom box where we talk about community partners, service partners that can provide some of those stabilization supports like healthcare, mental health, childcare, transportation, education, etc. It truly takes a community for a person to be able to sustain in housing. It's not the homeless response system to fix poverty, to solve poverty. Ultimately, we want to provide a foundation for people to build off of. So help them get into permanent housing, no matter what that may look like: safe, stable, affordable housing, so that they can start that foundation and then they can build off of that once they get into permanent housing. We're not aiming to create ideal living situations for people. We want, again, for people to be safe and to have something that's sustainable, permanent, long-term, but it may not be ideal at first. This is just a trampoline, or kind of like a opportunity for people to get to that, establish that foundation so that they can build off of. And then also, we're not trying to fix people. So we do know that there are people who, that have various different barriers and circumstances that may or may not be contributing to their homelessness. However, our goal is to make sure that people get into housing no matter what their situation is, and that they get connected to the services that they need to sustain in housing. So we really support and encourage folks to use the collective impact model, the collective impact approach, which allows for there to be a common agenda. So ultimately, to end homelessness. People who are housed are not homeless. So if your concern is homelessness, then your concern should be housing and making sure that people are getting housed as quickly as possible. And that's no matter what system or interest that you might have in the work of working with people who are experiencing homelessness. Having that shared measurement system. So again, when we say ending homelessness, we're talking about making homelessness rare, brief, and non-reoccurring. So having that shared measurement system that's looking at, are people returning to homelessness? How long is their length of stay when they are experiencing homelessness, when they are entering a shelter, or engaging in different aspects of the homeless response system? How long are they staying there? Are they returning? Are we preventing people from experiencing homelessness? We want to make sure that we have those shared measurements, and also monitoring equitable access and outcomes. We want to ensure, again, that everyone has access to the services that the system provides, and we want to ensure that they have equitable outcomes as well. We want to see those consistent and equitable returns to homelessness, or exits to permanent housing, or shorter length of stays in the system. That requires mutually reinforcing and equitable activities. So what are some ways that we can support this common agenda, this common goal that we have as a community? So that might include things like helping folks to navigate the housing process. So what are some ways that we can reduce those barriers, whether that's identification, whether that's community supports that person needs? There's a number of barriers that folks may face in navigating the housing process. Fair housing might be one as well. How, as a community, can we support that, and what is our role? Individually tailoring housing stabilization. So assuming that everyone is different and everyone is going to have different needs so that they can stabilize in housing. So thinking about ways we can individually tailor and be flexible to those needs so that we can accommodate the diverse populations that we're serving. And also thinking about linkages to natural and community support. So again, it's not the homeless response system to be there forever, but to be that springboard, to be that kind of trampoline. So what are we springing them to? Like, thinking about permanent housing, how can we ensure that people have the resources, the connections, so that they can sustain in housing long term? And again, constantly thinking, and what is my role in that? How can I support that? And how can this task force support that as well? Continuous communication. So to create this collective work, accomplish this common agenda, this common goal, we need to communicate. We need to establish clear, identified communication channels and processes, whether we're we establish something that allows us to meet on a regular basis, a monthly basis, to share data, to, constantly report on our progress, whatever that is for your community, whatever you identify that your community needs in terms of communication, establishing those channels and processes so that they continue long-term. And then a backbone organization. So an organization designed to be the link, whether that is your local COC, whether that is your one of your municipal offices, whatever that is, to really push along this, push along this agenda and allow for some of that coordination that may need to happen. So again, it's important to really understand the role of effective emergency shelter and really how that fits into ending homelessness, so that you're able to make certain decisions that affect emergency shelter in your community. They must be informed by the key elements of emergency shelter, which are housing first, safe and appropriate diversion, low barrier access, immediate and low barrier access, housing focus, rapid exit services, and data to measure performance. So I'm going to quickly go through some of these, but I really emphasize low barrier access and housing first as well. So I'll start off with housing first. And as I mentioned earlier, there are folks who do have various barriers that may or may not have contributed to their homelessness. However, we know that there are several people who are in similar circumstances, who have a criminal background, who have a history of evictions or poor credit history, or you may even know a person who's a registered sex offender but is not homeless. We know folks who have experienced some of these same barriers but are not homeless. And so considering that can help us to get into the philosophy of housing first, and the idea that everyone is ready for housing now. This person is not homeless and shouldn't continue to be homeless because of their credit history, because of their eviction, or because of their felony, and all these different, kind of barriers that oftentimes we're putting in front of people to resolve before they can get access to housing and housing interventions. So it starts with understanding understanding the housing first philosophy, which is believing that everyone is ready for housing now. And I say this sounds very, general and theoretical, but think about the ways that this can translate into some of the decisions that you're making. So thinking about where this shelter could be, thinking about, why it's important for it to be in certain places. Or I've heard from Casey and in the team that prepared me, just thinking about, and I think today too, I think someone said multi-site, do we need one site? Do we need multiple sites? In thinking about, the decisions that you need to make, consider the ways that housing first, or the lack of the belief in housing first, can influence those decisions. What makes you determine whether or not, a shelter, the brick and mortar shelter should exist in a certain community? Are we considering that, we are concerned about folks getting sober, or folks, accomplishing certain goals before they're ready to be served by the homeless response system? So getting back to the philosophy, understanding that homelessness is a housing problem. It is not a problem of mental health. It is not a problem of addiction. It is a housing problem. But housing first doesn't mean housing only. It just means housing fast, like quickly getting people into housing. But understanding that folks may need services. Oftentimes, people don't need services. They truly just need housing and self-resolve in a lot of ways once they are out of fight or flight and they have that stable, permanent place to call home. A lot of times they're able to self-resolve some of the other issues that they have going on in their lives. But some people may need services. Some people may need different kinds of services, different amounts of services. So we want to ensure that we're scaling that and ensuring that they are unique to each individual household, so that we're tailoring it to what their needs are. But also ensuring that the service participation is voluntary. We're not forcing people to do anything. We're not saying that they have to become sober, they have to get employment, they have to do anything before they have access to permanent housing supports and resources. So again, the philosophy shift includes everyone's ready for housing now, homeless is a housing problem, but really truly believing that permanent housing is a right to which all are entitled. People should be returned to or stabilized in permanent housing as quickly as possible and voluntarily connected to resources necessary to sustain that housing. Once you do that philosophical shift, or as you're doing that philosophical shift, that will translate into your practice. So, and when I say practice, apply that to whatever your role is. I'm not necessarily referring just to shelter workers or shelter directors or folks that work in the COC, but all of us. So we're thinking of that collective impact model. How can that translate into housing first, translate into our role? The idea that it's not a program, but it's more so this principle that's happening across the shelter, across the system, across the decisions that we're making. So it's not a one size fits all. There are people who are going to need all different types of support and resources, and that housing first is not housing only. So I really like this one as well, because I'm thinking about when you're thinking about placement of a shelter, think about the resources that are available in that community. Think about transportation. Think about, all that would be necessary or in aid of the work that's happening and that's connected to that emergency shelter. And shelter ultimately is not a destination. Like, again, this is an emergency intervention. It is a life-saving intervention. But only housing ends homelessness. So we're not thinking of shelter as this permanent, home or fixture for people who are experiencing homelessness. This is a pass through on the way to permanent housing. When folks touch that shelter, the next step ultimately is permanent housing for them. So again, making that shift so that can be really integrated into the decision making that you're doing in this committee. Housing First also advances race equity. So when we are screening out for people who have evictions or have criminal records or unemployment or have untreated mental health disorders, different things like that, we are disproportionately affecting people of color because we know that these occurrences happen at a disparate rate for people of color, particularly Black and African Americans. So in thinking about housing first, we are also thinking about how we can actively be anti-racist and addressing those racial disparities that we know exist in homelessness and who experiences homelessness. So the next key to effective emergency shelter is safe and appropriate diversion. And I just have one slide on this because I just want to quickly kind of just stress that diversion is an essential part to making homelessness rare. So remember we said ending homelessness is making it rare, brief, and non-reoccurring. So part of the role of your system, the role of your shelter, the role of your coordinated entry is shifting to this idea of doing diversion before intake. Before you're just admitting folks into shelter, you want to ensure that people are being diverted. So you're thinking about, does this person have any other connections, community support, alternatives to shelter? Do they have family and friends that they can connect with? And the community needs to be able to support that. Again, in ending homelessness is also making it rare. So how can the community support efforts to divert people at all possible? Within the shelter, that looks like, again, having these problem-solving conversations before intake, having resources to support that before a person is placed into a shelter, shifting from this idea of having these conversations up front about following rules. Is a person able to enter a shelter? What are they eligible for? Eligibility determination, screening, assessments, etc. Shifting those to, is there a place, sorry, I'm moving my camera. Is there a place where you were staying that is safe? Like before you entered this system, where else were you staying? What can we do to help you remain there? What will resolve your current housing crisis? And brainstorming and having these problem conversations. And what that looks like operationally is being able to have perhaps flexible financial assistance to assist a person with you know, small financial needs they may have to get connected back to permanent housing. Or it might be having community supports, like, you know, food resources, mental health resources, etc., that person could get connected to, so that they can remain or go back to the permanent housing situations that they were in before, or establish new permanent housing outcomes that are alternative to shelter. So again, I mean, I'm just trying to keep bringing it back to what you guys are doing in this committee, which is deciding where to place the shelter. So if you know that diversion is an important kind of pre-step, you know, a predetermination that needs to happen before a person enters shelter, you want to ensure that you have the supports and the community connections and the relationships that are needed to get folks quickly connected to the resources that they need, so that they can sustain in permanent housing. The next key is being low barrier and making sure that your shelter is accessible. So understanding that, you know, in order to play a critical role in ending homelessness, the shelters must be accessible to anyone who needs help. That requires us to check our own biases about who we think should be in shelter, and why we might feel anxious about serving certain populations or having contact with certain populations. You know, we shouldn't have to earn necessarily being in a shelter. Like, what is the criteria for being allowed to enter a shelter? We shouldn't be trying to heal or fix people's behaviors. Ultimately, we've learned time and time again that doesn't work anyway. That just keeps people out of the shelter. That keeps people unsheltered on the streets and experiencing literal homelessness, unsheltered. So we know that doesn't work anyway, even if we did want to focus that, it doesn't end homelessness. So we want to support people in supporting the change in people rather than trying to change their behavior. So when folks, you know, when folks are ready to be able to make certain changes or gain access to certain resources, we're ensuring that they know how to get connected to resources, that those resources are available to them, and that they have access to them. So that doesn't mean, oftentimes people hear low barrier and they just think it's going to be, you know, crazy. They think it's going to be crazy, that there aren't going to be any rules or any type of criteria, anything like that. In fact, it does mean having expectations. So you do want to ensure that you're providing safe shelter for folks so that they can have access to it. So that doesn't mean not having rules, but having these expectations of shelter participants about not actively using substances in the shelter, about violence, about engage what the role of shelter is ultimately, which is to get people into permanent housing, that this is not a long-term housing situation resource for you, that this is a emergency resource intervention that's here to get you into permanent housing. So having those expectations and communicating that to the guests who are staying there. That doesn't mean that you're allowing people to act in ways that are unsafe to themselves or others at all. Having those safety protocols in place, ensuring that staff are trained on crisis prevention and crisis resolution, ensuring that your local law enforcement and emergency mental health providers and so on and so forth, crisis intervention folks are all looped in part of this system of support for those who are experiencing homelessness in your community or who might have crises within the shelter, for example. That doesn't mean that you're letting anything happen or letting everyone in. Again, you have these expectations, you do have these safety protocols, but again, you're not presenting barriers to folks just simply because they're inebriated, for example. That's a common one that we see very often. So that's why I keep using that as an example. And it doesn't necessarily mean first come, first serve either. That is ultimately what what coordinated access is trying to prevent. That it's not first come, first serve, but it's very coordinated in a way where those with the highest needs are being able to be prioritized in the way that allows their needs to be met. And it doesn't mean forgetting about the safety of clients and staff. So I think this is kind of stressed throughout this slide, where ultimately you still are centering the safety of the clients as well as the staff that are in your shelter, but also for this sake in your community as well. You are centering safety. However, you are not allowing that certain concerns to be barrier for folks and accessing shelter. So operationally, that looks like screening people in, not out. Like, how can we increase our access to this service to as many people as possible? That is our goal, not screening people out and thinking about who should not be able to enter shelter. You want to ensure that your shelter is open 24/7, that people don't have to line up for bed each night or leave super early in the morning with no place to go. You want to ensure that folks are not drug or alcohol testing to get in or stay in. There's no criminal background checks requiring income to get in or housing readiness. So we encounter this term, and I wish I could just eliminate it from the field of homelessness, honestly. And I'm sure my team members will agree with this, but getting rid of this housing readiness, that folks need to check off certain boxes before they're ready for housing, that directly goes against the housing first model. And we know that that doesn't work. That actually extends the time that people experience homelessness. If you're requiring someone to engage in employment or get a job before they can, sign a lease, or, just do certain things, get an ID, or, engage in certain types of services before they can access housing, we know that ultimately, for one thing, people may not do it because they're being forced and required to do it. So for one, the success rate there oftentimes is very low because you're forcing people to do it. But then also we know that, again, that extends the length of time people experience homelessness. And oftentimes people just disappear. Folks that we're working with and we thought we were getting, some traction on and making progress with, just disappear because they don't want to engage the way that we're forcing them to engage. And again, we want to allow people pets and possessions. So allow folks, no matter what their gender identity is, no matter what their family composition is, which include pets as well. I think we have moved the needle a bit on service animals, understanding how to engage with folks who have service animals or emotional support animals, but also we want to ensure that people who have pets also have access to shelter, because that has been a very big barrier for folks who are experiencing homelessness. Oftentimes, if their pet is not allowed in the shelter or in their housing, they won't engage. They'll disappear oftentimes, and you'll find them unsheltered somewhere and not willing to engage with resources that can help them. And also possessions. Oftentimes you see encampments being cleared or folks not being allowed to bring their possessions into a shelter or don't have a place to put them. So we want to ensure that we support folks in being able to hang on to their belongings as well, because that is also a deterrent. Practice-wise, that looks like staff in the community. Well, I'll start off with this, but staff not being like house parents or behavior monitors or program monitors, but really being navigators, because thinking of the emergency shelter as being a resource with navigators who are partnering with clients to be able to support their housing success. So that translates into ways you communicate and engage with folks who are experiencing homelessness, but it also requires some training as well. So as I mentioned before, safe shelter is ultimately, safety is ultimately a priority. So that requires conflict resolution training, crisis de-escalation, trauma-informed care, motivational interviewing, and the list really goes on. How can we shift our thinking and shift the way that we are often trained to engage with folks to this new model that is being able to support wherever people are, meeting people where they're at, support that, and be able to, no matter what the barriers folks might have, be able to support them in obtaining permanent housing. So the philosophy shift for being low barrier is that shelter is life-saving. It is a life-saving intervention. And I like to think of shelter as like an emergency room. Like, we don't want to keep folks in the hospital, in the emergency room for a long period of time. It's meeting those immediate needs to keep people alive and then quickly getting them connected to the longer term, perhaps, supports that they need. Sometimes also, I kind of got tripped up there because sometimes it's not longer term. Sometimes folks just need that emergency, support, that emergency intervention, and then they're fine after. So that's also having that kind of mentality too, that we're going to be flexible because folks' needs are going to differ. Philosophy shift that shelter should be easy to access, and it should be easiest for the most vulnerable people. So folks who who do get turned away oftentimes by very high barrier practices. And what that looks like is no prerequisites to shelter, no sobriety requirement, no waiting list, having a coordinated entry so it's not first come, first serve, and prioritizing households who have the most needs, keeping the shelter open 24/7 for folks who need to access that, and having equal access rules, compliance, housing compliance, and the rules that do exist should only pertain to safety. Everything else is more so about the expectations that that the shelter has for folks who are guests there. And I say all of this because ultimately this translates into, okay, so how do we do that? Like, what does that look like? What does our community need to be and look like? And how does it need to collaborate so that we're able to support the work of this shelter, which is low barrier, which is housing first, which does diversion, and et cetera. Just a moment. I think my dog is throwing up. This is so embarrassing. One moment. Okay, sorry. The joys of working from home. Sorry about that. My dog is okay. All right. So this brings us to a perfect break where I can like hear a little bit from you all. And I wanted to do a little activity about what option creates the most access. So in thinking about low barrier, help me to understand which option on here creates the most access. We're going to go row by row, and we'll start off with the first one, which is about curfew, and then we'll stop there after we read the first row and decide which option, either option A or option B, provides the most access. I'm thinking that because we have some folks who are on Zoom, feel free to enter your option as we go along, enter your option in the chat. And for those who are in person, you can raise your hand because I'll just go one by one. You can raise your hand if you think you want to choose that option. So we'll do the first one as an example. So option A or option B. Option A is 10 p.m. curfew to secure shelter bed. Option B is no curfew with expectations that guests indicate their return to shelter. So if you think option A creates most access, either raise your hand or put A in the chat if you're online. Which creates the most access? So if you think it's option A, put option A in the chat, or if you're in person, raise your hand if you think it's option A. Okay, not seeing any, and I'm seeing some folks in the chat are already. Okay, so if you think it's option B, raise your hand or put B in the chat, which creates, if you think B creates the most access, raise your hand. Okay, I'm seeing most folks in the room raise their hand for B, and I'm seeing mostly B in the chat. Thank you guys for participating. So quickly, I'm just going to talk about curfew expectation. So just something to consider about. So the answer is B. B creates the most access because it doesn't restrict the time that people can enter shelter. One thing I want folks to consider is the time that people work. Considering that some folks may work overnight. Some folks may have, if they have a family, they may have to, childcare that they have to coordinate with. Oftentimes we find this to be a very big barrier of folks being able to access shelter. Also, and especially for this group who is thinking about placement of a shelter, think about transportation as well. What time does public transportation run to and from the shelter? Is there public transportation that runs to and from the shelter? Is there a shuttle? What are the resources that exist to be able to support folks getting to the shelter? Because that's something you want to think about. If you do have a curfew, like who does this limit? If we don't have, who does this limit if we don't, if we do have a curfew, who does this provide access to or create increase access to if we do have a curfew at all? Ultimately, the best practice is to not have a curfew. So I won't say that, but we do know that some shelters have it, and those are the important questions they should be asking themselves. So on to the second row. Inebriated guests can enter shelter as option A, and if guest is presumed to be under the influence, I'll just put UI for short, but if guest is presumed to be under the influence, they cannot enter shelter. So if you think option A is the answer that creates the most access, please raise your hand or enter A into the chat. All right, and now B. Which does, if you think option B creates the most access, either raise your hand or put that into the chat. Okay, so if I know we do have a microphone in the room, and so I kind of explained the first one, but I'm curious as to, for folks who answered option A, why is that essential? Why is that important to create access or increase access for folks into the shelter? Anyone who wants to volunteer, or folks who are online, if you want to raise your hand, I might have the ability to unmute you. We're gonna play around with that option, but if anyone wants to explain why option A, why they chose option A, feel free to raise your hand or unmute. Anyone want to volunteer? Be that brave volunteer. I'm not seeing any hands raised yet. I see one. Thank you.
So the answer, this is Jody, and it's best to give them safe shelter, no matter what condition they are, and then allow them to seek assistance if they want to, but knowing that they're off the street and inside where eyes are on is a good goal.
Absolutely, Jody. And one thing that you know, that was mentioned in your comment is the safety aspect of it. You know, being able to have, you know, be able to assist that person if they do need help, having eyes on them, having people who are around them is absolutely a safety issue. This could be a safety concern for the person themselves, but also for the community, you know, thinking about someone who's intoxicated who may not be able to make the most effective or safe decisions. It's better for someone to, you know, be able to be there in case something does happen. And oftentimes we find, you know, when we do receive pushback on what we call wet shelters, so shelters who do allow folks who are inebriated to enter, oftentimes the pushback is about, well, what's going to happen if, you know, they're dangerous or anything? Well, guess what? The same rules apply to folks who are not inebriated. At any time, someone who is not inebriated can become agitated and do something, you know, start a fight or argument or whatever the case is. So in that same way, you follow the same protocol you would for anyone who's presenting any type of safety, you know, concern or anything like that. And oftentimes we find too, we've heard from a lot of shelters too, that, and in my work, I've seen a lot of shelters too, where oftentimes people who come in intoxicated, who are inebriated, oftentimes just go to sleep. So that's also too, just checking our own kind of biases about people who struggle with addiction too. Oftentimes people we don't find it's often that they do pose a threat, you know, safety risk or safety threat to anyone. Oftentimes people just go to sleep and just use a shelter for that. Okay, so the third one, shelter guests with active addiction must engage in services to gain access to permanent housing support. If you think it's option A that creates the most access, raise your hand or enter it into the chat. Okay, and option B is shelter guests with addiction will engage in permanent housing planning from day one and voluntarily get connected to services during after the housing process. So raise your hand for B or put that in the chat. All right, exactly, and it's option B. And does anyone want to just talk about this option, why they chose B? Again, you can either raise your hand to speak, or if you want to unmute on the Zoom, feel free.
This is Sarah. I'm just thinking about the trauma and challenge of trying to access services and get clean when you're in the crisis of homelessness, and how the stability of shelter and support in finding home can actually improve and possibly increase the likelihood that someone has the capacity to begin to engage in that rather than the other way around.
Yes, I think what you're discussing is a really important is a really important area of consideration, because I think because folks who are experiencing homelessness oftentimes are in fight or flight. Like if you don't know where you're going to sleep, especially when you're with children, like if you're concerned about your safety, their safety, you're not able to control that because you have nowhere else to go, or if you are actively in a very vulnerable position of struggling with a mental health issue, or an addiction concern, or I'm sorry, struggling with your sobriety, that does put you in a very vulnerable place where having access to shelter can provide some of that sense of safety and sense of control. Oftentimes we do see that once folks can get out of that fight or flight, and they do have a roof over their head, even if it's temporary. So again, we're thinking of shelter as that temporary roof over someone's head, that oftentimes allows them to be able to think about what is the next step. And then that is also happening with the support of the shelter, staff that are working there. So it's important for staff to be trained on how to have those housing conversations. And I do know that many of the providers who are in your state are engaging in how to have those problem solving conversations, because we're actually working with the COCs on doing problem solving conversation right now. So I do know that is an important aspect of being able to get people out of fight or flight and be able to resolve some of those issues that they're having, and be open to some of the connections that are needed for them to be able to sustain in housing. Shelter can provide that, but also those warm handoffs to the community. I'm not sure if that answers a question that you might have been having around that, but I did want to expand upon that idea of helping folks, how shelter can help folks get out of that fight or flight and be able to, work and create their housing plan and move forward in their permanent housing progress. And while we're on that, did anyone have like anything else to add to that conversation or questions? Or I don't know if you want to clarify as well, if you had a question there, but I want to provide that space. Okay. So we'll move on to the, and I do see that there are some questions in the Q&A that were about different aspects of what we discussed. I do have a portion at the end, a segment at the end for us to do Q&A. So the last example that I have is that guests must have and show identification to access shelter. The other one is any guest, regardless of ID status, can access shelter. So if you think it's option A, raise your hand, or B, which if you think option A creates the most access, raise your hand or put it in the chat. I'm sorry, that's what I meant to say. A, raise your hand or put it in the chat. Okay, and if you think it's option B, where any guest can enter regardless of their ID status, raise your hand or enter in the chat. All right, so most people are saying B. And that's absolutely right. Some communities have expressed concern with that, like how can we ensure that people are who they say they are or things like that. But often possessions when they are experiencing homelessness, whether it's because of fire, because they were robbed, just because it's hard to keep track of everything. There are encampment sweeps. So many things can happen when a person is experiencing homelessness, that oftentimes folks do not have any identification at all. And so we want to ensure that, again, we're creating the most access to folks who need it, who are the most vulnerable, like those who don't have identification. So we want to ensure that we're not putting these barriers in the way of them accessing shelter. So you guys did a really great job with this exercise. Okay, so I'm gonna just quickly go over kind of what the last areas of the effective keys are, which is how, like, housing, rapid exit to housing. We want to ensure that ultimately our time that's spent with folks in shelter is aimed at getting them into permanent housing. So housing planning must happen from day one. Those conversations should happen even before a person enters shelter. Again, when I'm referencing diversion, that problem solving conversation happens before, and then it's translated into the conversations that are having within the shelter. So having that housing plan happening from day one, the person that is experiencing homelessness leads that housing plan, and that, again, there are no prerequisites to housing. What housing looks like within your community might be different based on the person, but also based on the availability. So I was prepped to understand that there is a lack of affordable housing in your city. There is an issue with, folks having access to affordable housing, which is common with communities across the country. So that requires creative solutions. And again, as you're thinking about where to place this shelter, there are some considerations that you might want to have about things like shared housing. So shared housing is something that many of us have done in our lives and are probably doing right now. If you're sharing any type of housing with another adult, you are doing shared housing. And so this oftentimes is it seems like a foreign concept sometimes when we're working with people who are experiencing homelessness. Folks should have their own, this thinking that folks should have their own apartment, that they should be able to pay it on their own, when oftentimes many of us are sharing housing and are sharing the cost. And so how can we support and facilitate that so that people have access to affordable housing within our communities? So this could look like a person that you're working, a shelter guest, living with a family member, a friend, and doing shared housing that way, each having separate leases. This could be two people within a shelter leasing up to, getting an apartment together, each individually having a lease. There's so many creative ways that this could look like. An elderly person that's experiencing homelessness, partnering up, I say partnering up, but being housed with a small family. This could look a lot of different ways, and it's our role to, provide those opportunities and support that kind of creative access to affordable housing. It could also look like temporary housing with long-term permanent housing plans. So it could look like, you can stay with this person for a family member for 2 months, and then, you have a plan in place to get your own housing, or to double up, or, do a shared housing situation with another person or another family household. Affordable dwelling units, thinking about accessibility and access to affordable dwelling units within your community, and also studio apartments. With that, you want to be thinking of, are there relationships that we need to be building with landlords? Do we need to be educating them on shared housing, on maybe short-term leases while people are on their way to a longer term plan? These creative solutions do take the some strategizing around how we can make this happen, and with that, connections to community partners like landlords, for example, that can support some of these creative solutions. And we've seen this happen very successfully in a lot of communities, especially high rent communities like Los Angeles or in Fairfield County, Connecticut. We've seen shared housing be that solution that makes housing more accessible to people who do have limited incomes. We want to ensure that we're diversifying our approach. So again, just remembering that folks may not need any type of services. Folks may need different types of services or different amounts of services. Oftentimes our perception of people who are homeless need all of these things is often based in bias. We have this certain bias about a person experiencing homelessness, and we think that they need all of these expensive and numerous, types of intervention. Oftentimes that is based in bias about what we think about people who are experiencing homelessness. But also think about the fact that service and stability could look different to different people. Some people might consider services to be faith-based related services or holistic services. So having that flexibility and allowing people who we're working with to lead that way, but also as a community supporting that as well, in connecting folks, being able to connect folks to those resources or identify the resources that exist in those in our community. So how can we create those warm handoffs? How can we ensure that folks who are experiencing homelessness have access to those services, are eligible for those services that might contribute, or more than likely will contribute to their stability in housing. And again, non-traditional to you might be very traditional to others. So kind of getting out of our own heads, stepping away from the biases that we might have. And remembering that the support network that we're working to establish for folks who are exiting these shelters, who are going to be entering into permanent housing in our communities, and in your community, in their communities, needs to be culturally relevant. So how can we also connect to diverse and cultural organizations that can provide the support that various folks will need, because we acknowledge that there is diversity that is represented in folks who are experiencing homelessness. So these are some questions that you want to ask yourself as you're thinking about the decisions that you all have to make. How do we right size our shelter? What is the right size? And that starts with your community needs. Identifying and acknowledging what are your community needs, what are the gaps. Your data can help you to make those decisions. So thinking about how can you improve your data, what's missing, what do you need, what is there, what is strong within your community, but then also being able to use your data to inform your decisions about shelter. And when I say data, I'm not just referring to your homeless management information system data or HMIS data. I'm not just referring to quantitative data in general. It may consist of qualitative data as well. How do people experience homelessness in our community? What do they feel the needs are? Folks who have gone through the system or are currently involved in various interventions in the system. How do they experience homelessness? What are the needs that they've identified exist within your community? Because that can help to right size your shelter and make certain decisions about how to effectively end homelessness in your community. One thing I like these little prompts that I use to, kind of filter your decision making through. So does X decision increase or decrease access? So I spend a lot of time talking about housing first, talking about low barrier, talking about being housing focused and, the shelter as a short-term intervention. So you want to ask yourselves, well, with this decision that we're thinking about making, how does this increase or decrease access? Does it affect access? Think about how we are perpetuating racism or eliminating racial disparities. How does this decision, or does this decision perpetuate racism or eliminate racism in our community? Really filtering your decisions through that type of lens. Does X decision align with the housing first philosophy? So are we putting barriers in front of people, before they can access certain types of, life-saving interventions like shelter? If we decide to place the shelter in this community, what does that mean? Like, are we putting a barrier in front of people? Will they have access to the type of resources that they need? And again, working with those who are experiencing homelessness to answer some of those questions and looking at your HMIS, your quantitative type of data, so that you can answer some of those questions as well. What community connections are needed to get and people housed? Get and keep people housed. So again, looking at your data, qualitative and quantitative. Do we have training needs? So we are going to be low barrier. We're not going to have a curfew, or we're not going to require folks to be sober to get into, and so on and so forth. Are there training needs? Are there training needs for staff? Are there training needs for various community, partners and folks who exist in these communities? Do we need to have messaging campaigns where we talk about, what the role of emergency shelter is, what this means for a community if a shelter is put into a certain community? Are there training needs and messaging that needs to happen around that? Again, thinking about law enforcement, any crisis intervention providers that you might have in the community. Are there ways that we can train them on engaging with folks who are experiencing homelessness, anything like that? So many questions. You can run down the rabbit hole with training needs. And then lastly, another question is, how does X decision impact our efforts to end homelessness equitably? So centering equity in the work that you all are doing. Will this create a disparate outcome if we place the shelter in this place? Will this limit folks of color from having access to this resource? Will this limit or decrease access for people who are LGBTQ? And so on and so forth. Thinking about populations who are often discriminated against, who often lack access to, resources and services, and thinking about how your decision might have an impact on that. And again, working with these communities, sub-communities to make some of these decisions. And oftentimes, I will say, the proof is in the pudding. Oftentimes, when you do look at your data, you will see certain trends. You will be able to make certain, kind of estimates about what impact certain decisions might have because they've had impacts before. You'll see that in your data oftentimes, especially when you're comparing across shelters that exist within your community, that exist within your state. You'll oftentimes see certain trends and patterns that indicate that certain decisions are having an effect on access or on equity. Okay, so I saved some time for questions, and Casey, let me know if time-wise we're doing okay. But please let me know if you have questions, and I'm gonna also look at the Q&A section. Okay, maybe take me a little while to read this one.
Folks, if you want to ask a question to Mia on the scope of the role of emergency shelter, or I know that there are a lot of questions from this group explicitly about low barrier shelters and housing first oriented shelters, this is your opportunity to place the work that we're doing here in Boise in the national context for best practices across systems in the United States. So I want to encourage us to prioritize questions from this task force that has an explicit charge when it comes to siting shelter, and push you all to ask questions if you have them.
I do see, Casey, do you want me to read any or answer any of the questions? Like how are we going to manage the chat? Because I do see some in the Q&A from the Zoom.
Let me have Rachel check the ones in the chat, and
Okay.
then we'll prioritize folks in the room first, because not everyone who is on the Zoom today is a task force member, and we want to make sure we're prioritizing questions from our task force folks.
Got it. Okay, thank you.
So looking at this, all of this is coming from the perspective of limiting homelessness, which is absolutely something that we all agree and want to do. But none of this is coming from the perspective of the surrounding communities in which these shelters may be located. Is there any data or studies or anything you can talk about in pertaining to that aspect or that perspective for the community?
Can you be more specific when you say, I think I may have misunderstood your question. So you said the information that we're coming from is coming from what? Or I'm
Like,
sorry, maybe just
this is all
restate your
about,
question.
homelessness and ending and housing first models. And that's all excellent. We can all absolutely get behind all of those things. But within the communities that these are situated in, is there any data about the impacts of these of shelters within those specific communities before and after shelter location or anything like that that we'll be able to look at?
So that data should exist within your community. So communities do have to collect this data. They do have to understand what their length of stay is within their shelters. They do have to understand where they are in terms of equity, returns to homelessness, and so on and so forth. And that's very common with other programs as well within the homeless response system. So that data does exist. And that's something that can be collected from your local continuum of care. So if you are, as I kind of like really emphasize within my presentation about looking at the data, that's something that the task force should be looking at and considering, because that data does exist. It has to be reported to HUD, to the Housing Urban Development. And so that data does exist. And I will say too, I think oftentimes I get this question too, like, okay, well, how does this like apply to us? Like, you're speaking philosophically, you're talking about housing first. I think ultimately, because I think it's also ultimately related, because if you're working on, placing this shelter, ultimately is with the goal of ending homelessness. You can put the shelter wherever you want. It could really be wherever you guys want. But the questions you have to ask yourself is, how is this going to advance our efforts to end homelessness if you want it to be effective, if you want the shelter to have meaning and for the placement to have meaning? And so consider housing first, consider low barrier, consider, diversion and all the things that I talked about in making this decision. It's ultimately never my job, or any person who considers, calls themselves a national expert. It's never, their job to tell folks what to do. It's ultimately to help folks to make the decisions that they need to make in considering what the best practices are. So keeping these ideas in mind are essential when you are making these decisions, but ultimately the decision is up to you, to this task force. And I just implore to encourage you all to, utilize some of these philosophies that I discussed today in your decision making, as that will influence whether or not it has a negative or positive impact on ending homelessness in your community.
Thanks for that answer, Mia. And I think that's helping address like the spectrum of philosophy and approach. And I think behind the question was also something we're hearing from community leaders is the approach to ending homelessness is one thing. How is it going to impact my neighborhood? And so I think the question behind that was, as National Alliance to End Homelessness, do you all have data or studies about the impact of shelters on communities where they're sited? And I think that gets a little bit to the collaborative approach that you were talking about. But if there's anything else you could share in that vein.
Yeah, and I think I can, if you guys want like specific, like, studies or case studies, I definitely can share that as well. But just so I can respond to the inquiry now, I will say that that, Casey, that's exactly why I did mention things like community supports and natural support. So considering what resources exist and how people can gain access to them, whether or not that access exists currently, or whether or not that there's work that needs to be done so that people can gain access to those supports. That can help can be part of what informs your decision making on where this shelter is placed. Thinking about whether it's faith-based resources, food resources, affordable housing. Think about transportation. Do folks have access to their doctors? Thinking about mental health supports that folks have. So I think those are the types of things you kind of want to research and know about these different sites. How will folks have access to supports and services if they're placed here? And one thing I'll say is, one misconception is that folks who are experiencing homelessness don't work. many people do work. So that's another that's another thing to consider about the placement of this site is, do folks have the transportation that they need to get to and from the shelter to their employment, or like I said, to their doctors or daycare centers or whatever the resources that they need to be able to even sustain where they are now. And of course, that will contribute to their permanent housing as well. But yes, I can share if you guys do want to look at some case studies or research that has been done this year, I can share that as well.
Perfect. And thank you so much, Mia. We're going to wrap for time, but I really appreciate everything that Mia brought to the table. We are at 12:31, so I just want to make sure we're respecting folks' time. We do have some hours with Mia after today's session. So what we can do is, again, since Jen is out, I'll be your contact. You can send emails to me directly if there are things that you're curious about from the presentation today, or as it relates to low barrier housing first oriented shelters. If you send me those questions, we can work with Mia to come back with, in addition to those case studies about community impact, what are the other things that we can work to provide answers from Mia directly that come from your concerns or questions about the role of emergency shelter. So Mia, thank you so much for coming today, and really appreciate it. And we'll be following up over email. You can jump off.
Awesome. Thank you for having me. And I wish I could see your guys' faces. I see like the back of your heads, but I'm looking forward to the hearing about the work that you do and, being able to support it. As Casey said, we do have a couple more technical assistance hours. So looking forward to supporting that, and also just on the back end, hearing about the wonderful work that you guys do.
Perfect. Thanks so much, Mia.
Thank you.
So just some housekeeping as we're jumping off for the day. One, reiterating, if you have questions about the role of emergency shelter as it relates to anything that was discussed today, or explicitly and specifically on low barrier housing first oriented shelters, send those questions to me. We will send them directly to Mia, who will be responsive to those questions. And I know that you have them because you put them on the feasibility criteria. So please engage with that process. Second is we're continuing to collect locations from you all. We've received a couple of different locations. We are moving through our process at the City of Boise internally and determining which sites are opportunities for siting shelter. We are also meeting with a brokerage firm this week to go through a scan of available listings that are currently on the market. And then we've received some recommendations from you all. So if you have those, again, because Jen is out within a family emergency, please send those to me and we'll make sure that those are added to that. Make sure you come up and sign the partner statement of commitment before you leave. And for the folks who are unable to attend in person, if you could send through chat that you want to add your name to the signature, we'll do it for you here. And then next week, we are going to be going through the theme of sheltered and unsheltered homelessness in Boise. So you can expect, as normal, to receive today kind of a high-level summary of what we did. And on Wednesday, you'll receive the homework and reading for what we're going to be doing together the next time. So any questions that I can resolve for clarity about what's coming next? Great. Reminder, we will be here today afterwards to do the feasibility, just open conversation. And I thank you all so much for coming back again this week.